Welcome back to Turning Hard Times to Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm pleased to have Bob Moriarty with me once again, this time to talk about a very important book titled The Money Revelation. It was written by a very interesting and talented gentleman named Alfred Landsberg, who was a banker, economist, author, and publicist living in Germany in the early 1900s. Though he was born in London in 1872, Landsberg moved with his parents to Berlin as a child. In 1907, he founded Bank Verlag publishing house, where he was editor and publisher of Die Bank magazine from 1908 to 1934. He passed away in 1937. The Money Revelation is comprised of a series of imaginary letters of Alfred's son, that is, to Alfred's son, in an effort to teach him the principles of money and finance. In a backhanded way, in a backhanded compliment, Vladimir Lenin called him, quote, the most competent of the bourgeois imbeciles, end of quote, and referred to him frequently in his own writings. Thanks to Make Enders from Germany and Robert Moriarty, who resides in France, both of them, they worked together to translate this book from German to English, and so we are now able to learn the insights of Alfred Landsberg, which, though largely, if not totally disregarded by almost every nation now, I believe they are as relevant today as they were 100 years ago, and most certainly provide a map, I'm afraid, that suggests the West is currently headed down the road of monetary destruction. The book has 3 volumes. The first one has to do with money, and that's the one we're going to focus on mostly today. The second volume has to do with value, and the third volume has to do with monetary emergency. So I'm afraid you would probably only get to a serious discussion of the first one, money, but that's probably the most important discussion in the book because the concept of money is so, well, it's so wrong, what people think of as money, and as we'll discuss with Bob. And I'm so glad, Bob, that you could come on with me to help us understand what money really is and why the misconception of money now is leading us down to the road of destruction. Thanks so much for joining me.
Well, it's a real pleasure. That's something I've been working on for 2 years, and it's in print now. It's an excellent book. It's in hardback. It's on Amazon US for $25 and Amazon Canada for $32. What's interesting to me, well, let's go back into how I got involved in the book.
Sure.
I'm going to call him Make because I think that's the correct pronunciation. Got in contact with me about 2.5 years ago, and he said there is a book that is only in German that is considered the very best book ever written about money, and I want to translate it into English and publish it. And I wrote him 5 or 6 times, and I kept asking him, how are you getting on with the book? How are you getting on with the book? What are you doing? And he finally came back and said, well, I'm kind of at a loss. I need to translate the book into English, and that's beyond my capabilities. Can you do it? And I said, well, yeah. And I've got some friends in Germany, and I sent the book to them, and I said, can you translate it? Now, given that a lot of the verbiage in the book revolves around money and finance, it was a little difficult for this woman to translate. And she came back and said, well, look, why don't I run it through a automatic translation program? And then you just edit it from there. So what we thought was going to take 6 months to a year actually took 2 days. So I got the book in electronic format. It was mostly formatted. And I went through and changed the archaic language of 100 years ago to something readers could understand today. So it actually was very easy for me to do that. And then we worked together. I sent the book to him. He came up with some edits. He sent the book back to me. And because I formatted 6 books of my own, quite bluntly, formatting and getting it in print was a piece of cake.
Mm-hmm.
Now, here's what's interesting about the book, and I think that you've read enough of this to know. I have never read a book that talked about the function of money. What is money supposed to do? We talk about what money should be or what money is, but I don't think I've ever seen a discussion of this is how money works. And it's brilliant from that point of view. Now, you were talking about the first book, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure that I would call it a book. I think the way he published it was almost like 3 pamphlets.
Uh-huh.
He published it in his magazine, and when it was assembled as a book, they talked about 3 books, and it wasn't 3 books, it was really 3 subjects. So people shouldn't be confused. It isn't a big, thick book. It's a simple book. It describes money. It describes how people work, and they're creating credit because the person who's paying them or is going to pay them owes them an obligation. And likewise, if you're a pig farmer and you want to get some rice, how do you exchange the pig for the rice? The mere act of working creates credit, and he takes money to its very most basic. It's a means of exchange of value, and it's very important that both sides get something out of it. Now, let me fast forward. The book was written from late December of 1920 until 1922. And of course, that was the very height of the German hyperinflation. So fast forward to today, we certainly appear to be going into hyperinflation. I've been following the energy market in Europe. And the cost of energy, coal, natural gas, and petroleum is up tenfold in the last year. And if that isn't hyperinflation, I don't know what is.
Yeah, and everything flows from energy. Everything else, energy, everything depends on energy. So, well, let's start talking about the book. And as I mentioned, it's a series. You say 3 pamphlets, essentially 3 topics. The first one being money. What is money? It was written. It starts out with the first letter to Alfred's son. It was written on New Year's Eve. These are imaginary letters. It was written on New Year's Eve, 1920. And what really struck me, Bob, as I read this, was the similarities of culturally to what's going on in the United States now. For example, it talks about 2 nations. Well, it was a nation divided into 2 groups of people, the haves and the have-nots. And the attitude of bankers and disregard for the people, the deplorables, if you will, as Hillary Clinton has called many of us. There are 2 different kinds of people, the good ones and the bad ones, the ones that are irrelevant and the ones that are important. That was something that I got out of the first letter to Alfred's son. And I think that letter sets the stage for the rest of the first topic on money, because it gets to the heart of why is there this division and the role that money plays in creating this division and dividing society. And so I don't know if you have any comments on the first letter and that idea.
Well, interestingly enough, the third topic, when he talks about the emergency, he goes into that in depth and talks about the destructiveness of inflation, because inflation literally is stealing. Somebody is stealing from the other person. And sometimes it's the person who's the purchaser, and sometimes it's the person who is the seller. If you negotiated a price for something for delivery 3 months in the future, and you set a price, and the seller had to honor that price, you ended up getting it for free. So they were transferring their very real value to you for pennies. And likewise, people who had taken their savings and they had it in banks, by the time they actually got the savings, which could have been hundreds or thousands of marks, it wouldn't have bought you a postage stamp. It's very important to understand that the nature of money is such that it transfers value to and from people. Okay. You do some work, you get paid. You create something of value, you get paid. Someone does something for you, you pay them. And money is how you do the transaction. Now let's go back and define what was going on at the time. Do you remember what the word is? What do we call November 11th, 1918? What the day the war ended, what is that called?
Armistice? I don't recall.
It is called Armistice Day.
Uh-huh.
And what is an armistice?
I guess I don't know, you're laying down your arms.
Strange enough, that's exactly what it is. I mean, it's perfect definition. Is it a victory for either side?
The war?
Yeah.
It's a victory that we stop fighting. That's a victory.
Strange enough, and that's a really good concept there. That's exactly right. But the key is that it's not like World War II, where there was unconditional surrender by the Germans and the Japanese. World War I ended with Armistice Day. There was a revolution going on in Germany at the time because of the cost of the war. And literally, the French and British soldiers were starting to revolt because they could see how senseless the war is. And it was an especially senseless war. So you had Armistice, and after Armistice Day, and when both sides pulled back, how did they settle the peace? What was that called?
I don't recall, Bob. You'll have to help me out with that one.
Okay, it was called the Treaty of Versailles.
Oh, of course, yes, and that required reparations from the losers.
Exactly. In the year that transpired after Armistice Day and before they signed the Treaty of Versailles, the French and the British, who were in far better shape than the Germans were, toughened up their stance, and they demanded payment for the Germans for being involved in the war. And let me give you an idea of why that took place, because it's important to understand. In every town and village in France, no matter how small, there is some kind of remembrance statue where they list the names of the people who were killed in World War I, World War II, Algeria, and Indochina. Now, the interesting thing is the town that Barbara and I had a little small farm in, there were 106 people from that particular village, 106 young men, including 3 from one family, who had been killed in the war. So if in World War I, in one tiny village in France, 106 people were killed, how many do you suppose died in World War II in the same village?
Well, I don't know.
5.
5?
Okay. So what happened, and this was true of the British, it was true of the French, and it was certainly true of the Austrians and the Germans and the Russians. We destroyed an entire generation of young men. So the British and the French were pissed, and they were in a position to cram it down the throats of the Germans, and they did. And they demanded payments from the Germans couldn't possibly make. So that's a long explanation of how Germany got into the position of printing money to beat the band. And printing money is exactly what inflation is. And then Alfred goes into the dangers of that and the ramifications of what it means to your society. Now, by 1922, the farmers in Germany couldn't afford the fuel to take their food to the major towns, and the people in the towns couldn't afford to buy food because there was so little of it, and because prices sometimes change 2 or 3 times in a day. The importance of the book is that it shows how deadly inflation is. And we've just kind of accepted inflation as something that's part of nature. And that's absolute rubbish, okay? Inflation is a tax. It's a way of governments paying for things without a direct taxation that people are aware of. And, they want to blame everybody for inflation. It's the oil companies, it's the gas stations, it's Putin. But the fact of the matter is inflation always goes back to the actions of the government. And that was true in 1922, and it's true in 2022.
Absolutely, Bob. And now I think maybe we should go back to the second letter where we start to talk about, you actually addressed credit and the need for credit when you talked about the pig farmer needing rice and why we have to have credit. Obviously, but money is actually evolves from production. That's one thing that's totally foreign, a foreign concept to currently to our economists. They see anything money just as whatever the government or the Federal Reserve creates, not so really money is, and your entitlement to money and your right to your money is based on what you produce. You produce something and someone else agrees to buy it and you have that contract with them. That is money. Do I have that right?
Well, you do, but the key to it is it's not only what you produce, it's what you consume. Both actions create credit. And that's important, and that's entirely separate from the mechanism of actually balancing the books. Okay, as far as the United States government's concerned, the Treasury just prints money. And that the one thing that I got out of the book was how dangerous inflation is. We went from, okay, here's what money is supposed to do, and here's why you need to understand it, which of course I totally accept, to, and here's what happens if you don't understand it, and that's incredibly destructive to the society. Some people end up far better off, and some people end up far worse off, and that's important because there's a great video, and I would highly encourage all of your listeners, go to Google and put in a video of monkey envy. And if you go to YouTube and watch this video of 2 monkeys in a cage, and one monkey has been fed grapes and the other monkey has been fed cucumber.
Yeah.
And the monkey that's being fed cucumber flat goes off. And what does that have to do with today? Well, the World Economic Forum and the meeting in Davos, 1,500 of the very richest and most powerful and most beautiful people in the world flew their private jets into Davos so they could sit down and have a meeting and talk about how the rest of us should learn to eat insects. And the WHO, not the WHO, the UN literally just came out and said private ownership of vehicles should be outlawed. So you got that situation where you got the ultra elite, the 1/10 of 1%, flying around in their private jets and eating lobster and steak. and then the 99.9%, which is the rest of us eating bugs. Now, if that isn't a recipe for disaster, I don't know what is. And he talks about it in the books. And the dichotomy today is probably 100 times more serious than the dichotomy 100 years ago. People were rich then, but not to the extent of flying all over the world in their private jet all by themselves to tell people they shouldn't own automobiles. You've got the Netherlands, which is telling 30% of their farmers, you're producing nitrogen, and nitrogen is a dangerous gas. Therefore, you're going to have to shut your farm down. Nitrogen is 78% of what we breathe. Since when has it been a greenhouse gas? I mean, that's simply absurd. But when I consider the dichotomy between what the ultra elite are doing and the rest of us, what they're saying we should do, there's going to be serious problems as a result. And of course, what did, I'm going to ask you another kind of trick question. What was the impact of the inflation of 1921 and 1922? What did it do to the German country?
Well, it diluted, it basically stole from the people that had legitimate claims to money, the people that were producing things, and the government. So the Germans had to print money to make good on the reparations. So they printed enormous amounts of money, which essentially was like the monkey that you're talking about that was given cucumbers. And of course, the value was transferred to France and to the other side, to France and England. So the people started to get hurt very, very badly. The masses of people started getting hurt very badly in Germany.
Okay, but what did it lead to? What transpired as a direct result of the hyperinflation?
Well, Hitler and the Nazis.
Thank you. Exactly.
That's exactly right. Now, Bob, I just want to break in here on a thought that you've been talking about. How dangerous it is, money printing, and you talked about the Davos crowd. How did that elite? I can remember the 50s and the 60s when we didn't have so many super, super rich people. And so I've maintained all along that what we've seen is this inflation, this money printing going on in the United States that has actually resulted in this reallocation of wealth to a very few number of multi-billionaires that are sitting around flying their private jets to Davos, as you talked about. Hasn't inflation already set this up? Hasn't the inflation already created this elite group of people that are now ready to make all the rest of us eat insects and walk everywhere we go?
Actually not. Okay. The success of Amazon has nothing to do with inflation. Okay. The key is that because of globalization, which is really computerization, okay, computerization allowed globalization, and globalization allowed somebody like Steve Jobs to take a minor computer company and build it into the biggest computer company in the world, and Bill Gates to make tens and hundreds of billions of dollars in Tesla. What has happened is globalization has concentrated the wealth in the hands of a very narrow group of people. Now, if your readers and your listeners will go to any history books are filled with stories of the elite and all the stupid things they did that ended up destroying their own societies. And I would submit that that's exactly what's going to happen with the World Economic Forum. The World Economic Forum really it has almost nothing to do with inflation. There's been a giant increase in the transfer to the 0.1% of 1% over the last 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
It's the stupidity of governments. But that wasn't because of inflation. Inflation was a side effect. Inflation didn't cause it. Inflation was a result. But what we've done is we've concentrated the wealth into the hands of a very narrow group of people who are totally unelected, who are looking out for themselves. And you know, you use the term already. Hillary Clinton said it, okay? We're absolutely meaningless to these people.
Yes.
And things like COVID, I mean, frankly, COVID was depopulation. They wanted to get rid of a bunch of us so they can keep the rest of us in slavery. But there has been a deliberate effort on the part of the World Economic Forum and many governments. Klaus Schwab has introduced 3,800 of its acolytes into governments of countries all over the world. And this unelected group of people are destroying the economy. Inflation is just part of it. I mean, certainly in Europe, we have a very bad drought this year, which is caused by nature, okay? But the cost of energy and the cost of fuel is going to go through the roof very shortly. The nuclear power stations in France are having to shut down. Germany is going to lose the ability of the Rhine River to transport coal and grain literally this week, okay? So inflation is part of it, but inflation is not all of it. What is important there, and he absolutely talks about it in the book, is the concentration of wealth. The people who get the benefit of negative things, such as inflation. But the concentration of wealth today is probably 100 or 1,000 times greater than it was back then.
Right. Well, for sure. And I think obviously what comes through in the book and an understanding of what money really is, what credit and money really is the supply side of the equation. The Keynesians have been all about the demand side, printing money and deficit spending by governments, but clearly now whether it's a natural event, and we're talking about the drought that's keeping the rivers from being able to transport goods, all manner of supply issues that have cropped up, some of which have been man-created, such as COVID, created by governments that have restricted the flow of people and so forth. Some of it is nature, but when supply is cut off and the monetary system or the same units of currency still exist, then we're going to have inflation, right?
Exactly right. And strange enough, I mean, the U.S. just passed an important law, and everyone kind of misses the most important thing. The amount of money that the government's going to spend is relatively minor. It's less than 1% of what the government's going to spend over the next 10 years. But what is important, and most people have ignored, is the militarization of the IRS. They're going to double the number of agents. And to be an IRS agent, you're going to have to be qualified with a weapon and be prepared to use it. And I'm just absolutely staggered at the idea of IRS agents running around armed. They walk into your office and say, okay, they pull their gun out and say, we don't agree with your figures, hand over all your money.
Yeah.
That happened in Roman times, where the Roman government actually allowed people to become private citizens, private companies, to become tax collectors, and they got to keep a portion of what they collected. And I'll just flat tell you, that's exactly what's going to happen now. And I don't believe that existed during the German hyperinflation. I'm certainly not aware of it.
Yeah. We're just going to have to leave it go at that, Bob. We're out of time already. It's incredible. We've barely scratched the surface, and I hope that we can come back and talk some more about this book, the contents of this book. What we've talked more about today is the application of the concepts, some of the early concepts introduced in this book. But the book goes on further. Letter 5, for example, talks about the migration of money, the immortality of money. We get into interest rates and the importance of interest and where gold fits into the monetary system and why it's a good thing to have. but not necessary, not absolutely necessary. There's just a whole lot of topics that are so relevant to what's going on today, Bob, that I hope that we can come back and pick this up sometime in the very near future, before it's too late for people to contemplate, because I think we're on a slippery slope right now towards something that most people can't even begin to recognize and fathom. Any last thoughts before we conclude?
I totally agree with what you just said. And let me say, and of course I'm talking my own book in a way, I participated in making this book happen. I don't get any of the revenue from the book, and I don't want any revenue of the book. But for $25, it will give you a far better understanding of money than you've ever had before. And there's some really valuable lessons in there, given the crisis that we're facing today, because of the destruction of the economy, COVID, and this incredible concentration of power and money in the hands of very few people who frankly want to turn the rest of us into slaves. I'm not particularly interested in being a slave.
No, nor should anybody in their right mind, Bob. I want to thank you so much for spending the time with us today to help us start to understand. And I would agree totally. The money revelation is so important. There's so much there that when I started preparing for our discussion today, I said, "Oh my goodness, I have not spent the time I need to." I've got through the first volume. And the other two, value and money emergency. Maybe very quickly, what does the value section have to do with? I mean, just give us a quick overview of that discussion of value.
And I couldn't do a quick overview. We'll have to do that for another time.
Oh, okay. And you did mention the monetary emergency, which is the third volume, and you think we're fast approaching that right now in the United States. I would say that if you ever look at a chart of hyperinflation in Germany, you'll see a long sort of flat line, and then all of a sudden it's a hockey stick. All of a sudden it just takes off like a bat out of that hot place. And it is not a good thing. And so people need to be on their toes, because this thing, I think, could spring up almost at any moment. So
give me one more minute, because it's very important. You just raised an important issue. Hyperinflation is not a lot of inflation. Hyperinflation is when people lose belief in the currency. And when they lose belief in the currency, they run out, spend everything they can as fast as they can. And I think we're very near that situation when you look at the increase in credit card debt and the increase in the number of people applying for credit cards. We are right at the stage where people are about to give up on the value of the dollar, and that's going to cause problems.
Well, I'm afraid you're right. I hope and pray you're not, but it looks that way to me as well. Thank you so much, Bob, for being with us, and we'll look to pick this up sometime in the near future once again.